Good evening. My name is Pauline Rockman, and on behalf of my co-president, Sue Hample OAM, and our board, our director, Jane Joseph, and the staff at Melbourne Holocaust Museum, I'm delighted to welcome you to the first public event in our beautiful new Melbourne Holocaust Museum. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather and accept the invitation contained in the Uluru Declaration from the Heart to walk together with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in a movement of the Australian peoples for a better future. And I acknowledge my elders, Nishule Hashoa, the survivors of the Holocaust, and promise to uphold my commitment to maintain their legacy. Zachor, remember. Please join me in welcoming our precious survivors here, including Sesha and A.B. Goldberg, and Paul Greenwald, community leaders and distinguished guests. I'd like to mention Terry and John O'Lazarus, our major supporters, members of the Rosencrantz family here, Lisa Kennett, President of Jewish Care, and Helen Maimoff, OAM, Chair of the Melbourne Holocaust Museum Foundation. Looking around this room, it's just amazing to be standing where I am, to see your faces and everyone here, and the ruach, the spirit that's here in this room this evening. Sadly, there's some we are clearly missing, but in truth, their legacy and presence is ever felt. The Rosencrantz oration was created in 2008 in memory of Betty Rosencrantz, Zichron Lebracha, and to honour the legacy of Shmuel, Zichron Lebracha, as the second president of the museum. This oration provides a distinguished platform to explore various aspects of the Shoah and its relevance today. We thank the Goldman and Lazarus families for their support. This enables us to bring experts from around the world here to Melbourne to share their knowledge with us. Over time, we've been privileged to hear from such esteemed speakers, including Piotr Szewinski, director of the Auschwitz Museum in 2010, eminent scholar Michael Berenbaum, 2018, Stephen Smith, former CEO of the Shoah Foundation in 2019. Tonight we are honoured to welcome Sara Bloomfield, Director of the USHMM, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Her topic is prescient. It's entitled The Power of Truth, Holocaust Education in the 21st Century, and she'll examine the importance and relevance of Holocaust education and museums today, and the challenges they face, and how we can respond to them using the power of truth. This topic certainly serves to emphasise the significance and urgency of our work, especially given the rising incidence of racism and anti-Semitism we see every day around the world, threats to our democratic values. Dear Shmuel, how proud you would be at this evening's event, the wonderful venue, indeed our museum. It's a true validation of your extraordinary efforts and your contribution in those early formative years of the then Jewish Holocaust Centre, and indeed, of course, of all our precious survivors. It's now my pleasure to welcome to the podium Terry Lazarus, granddaughter of Shmuel Rosencrantz. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I can't quite believe that another year has gone by and we're here again on November the 9th at the Betty and Shmuel Rosencrantz oration. But things are a little different and a little extra special tonight, being the first official event in the new Melbourne Holocaust Museum, which, might I add, is truly something to behold. I am thrilled to be in person and see so many people here tonight, along with the many I'm sure are streaming this from home. We have all shown such adaptability and openness to change over the last few years, which has resulted in this amazing hybrid world we seem to now be living in. But it really is great to be here and truly present with you all. I'm incredibly excited to hear our amazing speaker, Sara Bloomfield, tonight, as her experience and knowledge is remarkable, and we have been hoping to have her here to join us at this event for many years. Not to mention, the topic of education is one close to my heart. As you would have heard me say many times over the years, and hopefully you're not sick of me just yet, education was always and will continue to be the cornerstone of my family. Growing up, it was drilled into me, time and time again, the importance of education, not just for myself and my own future, but also in the wider communal context. Sitting at the same Shabbos dinner table as my Zayda, Shmuel Rosencrantz, and my father, Leon Goldman, meant that there was no way that tradition, education, and a community focus were not going to be central themes in my life. Despite incredibly different experiences of 1930s and 40s Europe in Austria and Poland respectively, they both saw horrible things with their young and innocent eyes and carried these memories with them for the rest of their lives. It was this that drove them both to ensure that the legacy that they left behind was one that continued to safeguard the memory of the Holocaust and strengthen the message of never again for generations to come. Zayda's contribution to the then Jewish Holocaust Centre is well known, as he was too by many of you here. He was a community stalwart who dedicated his life to the betterment and continuity of the Jewish community here in Melbourne. His face was known, his voice was recognised, and his public speaking prowess was renowned. My dad, on the other hand, was a little quieter in his support of the community, often sitting back and providing support to many organisations as a silent, nameless benefactor, but deriving such joy and nachas from seeing all facets of the community grow, learn and thrive. This was until his final few years, where he decided to leave his name upon the new Holocaust Centre, where we stand tonight, and thus the Judy and Leon Goldman Learning Centre was born. See, I told you education was big. This leads me to a story about how it all truly clicked for me, the importance of Holocaust education specifically, and a funny coincidence around our speaker tonight. At the completion of high school, far longer ago than I care to disclose, I made a conscious decision to not join my classmates from my Jewish school at a university where I knew I would have known a lot of other Jewish people. I wanted to meet new people and experience new things with those outside of the community bubble I'd been so immersed in for my entire life up until that point. I made two very close friends during my undergraduate degree, so much so that we decided to go travelling together just before the start of our postgraduate year. We were joined by my best friend from Sydney, whom I had met 5 years earlier on the March of the Living program, and the four of us set off for the US. We had spent about 12 days in New York City before deciding that we wanted to take the train down to Washington, DC to explore for a day, with literally zero planning beyond this. We walked out of Union Station without a clue of where we were or what we wanted to do for the day. And so we wandered, and we wandered, and we wandered a little more, and we ended up standing outside the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. My best friend and I were anxious to suggest we enter and explore. Would our non-Jewish friends be interested? Would this be some boring museum with no personal connection? Do they even really care? To our delight, they asked us whether we would be okay to go in, whether we were comfortable doing so, or if it's not something we would want to do. See, they'd never been close enough to a Jewish person to ever have a conversation about the Holocaust. They knew so little and thought perhaps it may be too hard for us to confront. We explained that it would truly be an honour to walk around the museum with them, explain our family's histories and stories, and tell them about our own experiences in Poland on March of the Living. The next thing you know, hours have passed and we're walking out of the museum in the dark and rushing back to get our train on time. Our time at the museum opened up some incredibly important conversations and really gave us an opportunity to forge a deeper understanding of each other and grow our relationships, which have lasted to this day. It highlights to me the power of education and the opportunities provided to us to learn and to grow, and it makes me so incredibly proud to be a small part of this amazing evening and the Melbourne Holocaust Museum. As the years go by and the voices of the survivors quieten, museums like ours and those around the world will become one of the most crucial parts of Holocaust education and memory. However, what this also means is that we have an obligation to continue to educate ourselves, educate each other, and open channels of communication with those who are not yet educated so that the voices and their stories are never lost.
Germans went wild and they were running after people, trying to just hit them. And people were dragged around the ground, over the ground and everything. It was just a complete riot going on, and that went on for quite a while. I mean, you know, the reason they call it Kristallnacht is because the glass in the morning was all over the place, and when the sun came out, it all was sparkling.
Kristallnacht, which of course at the time we didn't know what it was. We just noticed one night, I was woken up around about 11 o'clock, a large number of men shouting, screaming, carrying torches and blaring songs and shouting. And we heard crashes, we heard thuds.
If you would have seen the synagogue after, you would have said a tornado went through or something like that. It was unbelievable. They smashed our businesses completely. Like with this, again, with hammers and things, and they wrote on whatever there was left, they wrote Juden raus.
Hello, good evening everybody. I'm Sue Hampel and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Sara Bloomfield to Melbourne for the 2022 Betty and Shmuel Rosencrantz Oration. And I can't quite believe that Sara is finally here after 3 long years of COVID delays. Sara has led the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for 24 years. She has been instrumental in building a global institution that raises Holocaust awareness, deepens understanding of the lessons of the Holocaust, confronts denial and advances genocide prevention. Sara joined the museum in 1986 when it was a project in development, and she worked in a variety of roles before becoming the director in 1999. Sara serves on the International Auschwitz Council and is the recipient of the Officer's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland and 5 honorary doctorates. My connection with Sara goes back to 2005, when we crossed paths in the rugged terrain of Patagonia, South America. That remarkable coincidence and connection has led to a long friendship and Sara returning to Australia 48 years after her very first job as a young teacher in Sydney. Sara is a passionate advocate for Holocaust memory. As the director of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, she has advanced a living memorial which has over 1.6 million visitors annually. The museum teaches the history and lessons of the Holocaust to audiences worldwide and inspires leaders and citizens to confront hatred, prevent genocide, and promote human dignity. Through her involvement with the USHMM, Sara has met every single US president, from Jimmy Carter to Joe Biden and all the ones in between. She has met hundreds of survivors, including Elie Wiesel. She has shaken hands with numerous heads of state, including the late Queen Elizabeth II. She's been blessed by Pope Benedict XVI. She's met Margaret Thatcher and, more recently, President Zelensky from Ukraine. Sara, we are honoured that you have travelled across the globe to Melbourne to deliver tonight's address on the power of truth, Holocaust education in the 21st century. Can you please welcome Sara to the podium?
It was that vacation in Patagonia, and I was sitting in a van with the person I lived with when I came to Australia, and I was listening to this couple talk in front of me, and I said, I think that's an Australian accent. And then these people with an Australian accent, guess what they started talking about in the middle of Patagonia? The Holocaust. And I'm going, oh my God, but I'm on vacation. Anyway, I'm not on vacation now. But I am back in Australia. It's a wonderful homecoming for me. It has been, I came to this country 50 years ago to have an adventure. And I don't think I'd be director of the Holocaust Museum without that experience. So it was quite a wonderful, transformative experience for a young woman from the Midwest in the US. So thank you, Sue, for bringing me here. And I really want to thank the Rosencrantz family for making this possible. And there's been a lot of distinguished people ahead of me, so I feel like I'm in very illustrious company. And Terry, where is Terry? Those were fantastic remarks, and I'm glad you had a meaningful experience at our museum. We'd like to think that we inspire a new conversation, and it sounds like that was what your day was about. Thank you all for coming, and special thank you to the people who support this remarkable institution. I've spent the last couple of days here walking around, learning about your plans, meeting the staff, and I am exceptionally impressed. The people that work here are dedicated. You knew that before I walked in, but I just want to tell you, they are creative, they're thoughtful, they are rigorous. You are very, very fortunate to have them. And then to our beloved survivors, it's always an honor to be with you, and you always make everything so much more meaningful. And we do all this work for you, and we do it for the future, but it's always for you. So, you can put that up, thank you. Oh, and I was supposed to say that I'm gonna give my remarks in the dark. You won't see me now, you're gonna look at the slideshow I prepared, but one picture is worth 1,000 words, and I put together a slideshow to kind of illustrate some of the ideas that I wanna share with you tonight. So that's why I'll be in the dark. So, as was said, I left Australia in 1974, and through a very odd series of events, 12 years later, I ended up in Washington, D.C., working for a fledgling project to create a memorial museum to the Holocaust, and of all places, America's National Mall. And from the very beginning, the project faced significant skepticism from parts of the American public, from the Jewish community, and even from Holocaust survivors. Each had their own different concerns, but I want to focus on the many members of the public who felt the Holocaust was not relevant to their lives. After all, this happened to another people on another continent. And as they said, quote, "The Holocaust has nothing to do with us." Well, when the museum eventually opened in 1993, it was clear from the widespread favorable public reaction from non-Jews and Jews alike that the Holocaust did indeed have something to do with us, with all of us. The museum that opened almost 30 years ago demonstrated that when presented in all of its Jewish specificity, the Holocaust also contained universal lessons that had much to say about our own nation and modern societies in general, and above all, much to say about human nature. The Holocaust is a timeless reminder of two essential lessons that we forget at our peril. Technological progress is not moral progress, and the unthinkable is always possible. In fact, the Holocaust, as has been said, is more relevant today than ever before, as our world faces numerous challenges: constant assaults on truth, ongoing threats to democracy, increases in anti-Semitism, racism, and ethno-nationalism, and the growth of Holocaust distortion and denial, even in the very lands where the Holocaust happened. And all of this, as we know, is enabled and amplified by the rise of social media and an alarming decline in history education. Good history education not only tells us where we've been, but it reminds us that the past is not just a series of people, places, and events. To understand history is to understand the causes of events and the complex dynamics among several factors: the broader context, deep roots, powerful ideas, specific circumstances, and above all, human beings. The world is always changing. Human beings, not so much. On the day the museum opened, Elie Wiesel said the museum is not an answer, it's a question. Indeed, I would say it is many questions. Why did the Holocaust happen? Who was responsible? What were the warning signs? How could things have been different? Inspiring people to reflect on these questions is at the heart of our museum's educational strategy. It's essential that people understand the Holocaust was not inevitable, but the result of many decisions by many people over time. And there were multiple causes, warning signs, and turning points, like Kristallnacht, along the way. Such an understanding can help people think about their own roles and responsibilities in society today. Our goal is to advance critical thinking, something that was sorely missing in the Weimar Republic, even though it did hold some promise. After all, Weimar Germany was an advanced, educated country. It had a democratic constitution, free speech, and a long-standing rule of law. Germany was the first nation in the world to adopt social insurance for the elderly. It had more Nobel Prize winners than any other country, and some of the most respected Christian theologians. And yet, it would be very reassuring to think that Nazism was just a sudden aberration, but it wasn't a meteorite that fell one day from the sky. Nazism had deep roots in German and European history, and today, with the benefit of hindsight, we would call these deep roots warning signs. What do I mean when I say deep roots? Well, we all know social media is ideal for conspiracy theories, which are very much in the news. But history reminds us just how old they are. They're a consistent thread throughout centuries of anti-Semitism in all its various forms. Medieval Christians accused Jews of murdering Christian boys. But as we can see today, anti-Semitism easily adapts itself to any kind of social condition. And after the religious accusation of the blood libel, more secular versions would later emerge. The Rothschilds in the 19th century, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in the early 20th, and in our own century, theories blaming the Jews for 9/11, COVID, the weather, even the Holocaust. Conspiracy theories may be worse in times of great change and uncertainty, but they always serve the same purpose: to give human beings something we all crave: simple answers to complex questions and ways to justify our actions. People see them reflecting what they perceive to be fundamental truths, if not actual facts. Joseph Goebbels, one of several Nazis with a PhD or another advanced degree, acknowledged as much when he described the protocols as, quote, the inner but not factual truth. The late 19th century American writer Mark Twain is thought to have said, "A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. Now, Mark Twain did not know where technology and mass communications were headed, but he surely knew human nature. Another person who understood all this was Adolf Hitler, who wrote in Mein Kampf, "The art of propaganda lay, quote, in understanding the emotional ideas of the great masses who are more easily victimized by a large lie than a small lie." So it should come as no surprise that guess what Hitler's first job was in the Nazi Party? Any guesses? He was the head of propaganda. And he later wrote a great line about propaganda. He said, "It's a terrible weapon in the hands of an expert." And just think about it. In the internet age today, who's not an expert? So understanding how the Nazis deployed propaganda is just one example of why studying history is so important. It shows us how our fellow human beings in another time and another place faced problems and how they responded to those problems. It shows us why they made certain decisions and the consequences of those decisions. So history should challenge us, and I challenge each of you to ask questions about our own motivations and choices. They always have deeper roots than we think. That's why education must start well before the Nazis emerged as a movement, through an understanding of history. Perhaps we can better see the deeper roots that we are probably planting today, and the ones that shaped the world we live in, and the ones we're shaping that will shape the future for our grandchildren and the choices they will face. In the late 19th century, Europe was undergoing enormous economic, political, and social changes. New technologies led to rapid industrialization, urbanization, and globalization, and resulting in vast increases in poverty, disease, and crime. And new questions: how do we organize human societies? All this dislocation created a perception of winners and losers, widespread insecurity, fear, and resentment, and desperate searches for easy answers to complex questions. In Germany, a toxic brew of 19th century ideas and 20th century events would create a perfect storm. Anti-Semitism, that was hardly new to Europe, having been around for a mere 2,000 years. What was new was a new form of anti-Semitism legitimized by the so-called latest science. So there were old ideas like anti-Semitism and new ones like social Darwinism and a belief in survival of the fittest. Another new idea was the pseudoscientific eugenics movement, which began in Great Britain and was later used to justify racism and racist anti-Semitism. These ideas included beliefs that human beings could be divided into distinct biological groups, races, and that they could be ranked in a hierarchy from higher races to lower races. Incidentally, so-called scientific racism was supported by some of the most prominent scientists and intellectuals, and it gave legitimacy not only to anti-Semitism in Europe, but also to racism in Europe's overseas colonies and America's Jim Crow South. Proponents of eugenics promoted higher birth rates for whites of so-called good stock, while limiting the reproduction of so-called less desirable individuals. In Europe, the US, and elsewhere, eugenicists recommended the forced sterilization of what they called the unfit, those with mental illnesses or disabilities deemed inherited. One leading Nazi said, "Nazism is merely applied biology." So it should come as no surprise that the Nazis' first victims of systematic murder were not the Jews, but disabled Germans who did not live up to the Nazi ideal of racial purity. Incidentally, this was where the Nazis first experimented with gassing as a more efficient way to carry out mass killings. And those responsible for these crimes were bureaucrats, nurses, and doctors, such as this highly respected pediatrician who killed thousands of disabled children. Many of these professionals would later go on to work at the killing centers in occupied Poland, where millions of Jews would be murdered. The murder of the disabled, which began almost 2 years before the genocide of the Jews, was clearly a major warning sign. Today, many scholars call it the dress rehearsal for the Holocaust. The Nazi aspiration to create a racial utopia was not only based on scientific racism, but also another late 19th century idea emerging in various parts of Europe, ethno-nationalism, which called for the establishment of ethnically homogeneous nations to which Jews could not belong. In 1889, the French writer and politician Édouard Drumont founded the Anti-Semitic League of France to advance this new thinking. Drumont was perhaps aware of the work of another influential ethno-nationalist, the German journalist Wilhelm Marr. Marr argued that Jews and Germans were separate biological races locked in an eternal struggle with each other for survival, and that the mixing of races was harmful to Germans. He advocated for the forcible removal of all Jews from Germany, even those who had converted to Christianity. And when did he do this? 10 years before Hitler was even born. This book is entitled The Way to Victory of Germandom Over the Jews. Now, Hitler was just 25 when World War I broke out. This brutal, dehumanizing struggle collapsed societal norms and bred widespread destruction, suffering, and uncertainty. Aggrieved groups embraced new ideologies that challenged the old order. As multi-ethnic empires collapsed, many new nations were created, deepening questions about national identity and belonging, and the status of Jews and other ethnic minorities. As the Russian Revolution in 1917 inspired radical leftists everywhere, elites regarded fascism as the only bulwark against communism. Democracy seemed unable to respond to all of these numerous challenges. And yet, in this really fraught environment, Germany had its first democracy, the Weimar Republic. Weimar Germany experienced a chaotic period of clashing extremes of the far left and the far right, communism versus Nazism, creating backlash after backlash as the center continuously hollowed out. Nazi leaders instinctively understood what brain science today now confirms, that we human beings are not rational creatures as we would all like to think. Rather, we are essentially emotional creatures, often receptive to simplistic solutions to address our fears. The Nazis provoked fear to explain the causes of Germany's problems, but they did something else. They also had a compelling positive message. Appealing to all segments of society, the Nazis offered hope and a vision for a new people and a new future, a racially pure future that would overcome long-standing societal divisions and bring unity, pride, stability, and national renewal. They skillfully created an inverted universe, redefining morality, protection of the German people. That became a moral act. The notion of universal human dignity was considered a weakness, actually a reflection of so-called Old Testament Jewish values. Carl Schmitt, a respected political theorist and Nazi supporter, condemned the idea of universal human rights, saying, "Not every being with a human face is human." It might be comforting to think that all Germans were like Schmitt, fervent Nazis. But by the time Hitler assumed power, the highest percentage of the vote he had ever attained was only 38%. Also consider this, The Nazi Party platform had 25 points. Only 4 were anti-Semitic. Others included goals such as outlawing child labor, welfare for the aged, land reform, and education for gifted children. This election poster promises work, freedom, and bread. And notice this appeal to try to steal workers from the left. Clearly, some Germans were rabid anti-Semites, but hardly all. Many ordinary people and elites thought Hitler's anti-Semitism was too radical and violent. Yet they also thought he offered answers to years of multiple crises. Those answers rested on the promotion of ethnic revival, creation of the racial state, and removal of what they considered an existential threat to their biological community, namely the Jews. Most Germans were indifferent to the intensifying persecution of their Jewish co-workers, neighbors, and even friends. And of course, indifference is what all perpetrators count on, because without the indifference of most and the complicity of many, the Holocaust simply would not have been possible. It's sobering to realize that the Nazis were in power for 8 long years before they began the genocide of the Jews. 8 long years when Germans and Europeans fully knew about the escalating persecution of Jews and others inside the ever-expanding Third Reich, as did the Americans, who kept their doors shut tight, and the British, who limited immigration to Palestine. So what does this mean for our own times? As a start, we must conclude that after centuries of various forms of anti-Semitism, it's not an eradicable disease, nor are racism and other forms of hate. So can we tackle the problem of indifference? Is that too a problem that's ineradicable? We're all susceptible, and as the Holocaust teaches us, we all seek simple answers to complex questions, and we're all adept at rationalizing our decisions. Yet the Holocaust also teaches us that each of us has more power than we think. We too live in an era of unprecedented change. The 20th century began with the growth of mass communications, a major war, revolution, a pandemic, and then a global economic crisis, the Great Depression. Think about our own century. It began with a war waged initially by Al-Qaeda, a severe recession, and an ongoing technological revolution that is so fast and so profound, it's far exceeding our capacity to understand its societal and moral dimensions. And now we too have had a pandemic, and yet another war in Europe, and of course, economic challenges. That's why a historical perspective is so important. History reminds us of these vulnerabilities of human societies, even democracies, especially in times of change. And we're facing an ever-accelerating rate of change. The futurist Ray Kurzweil predicted our society would effectively experience 20,000 years of technological progress in the 21st century alone. Think about that, 20,000 years of progress in the 21st century alone. And remember, the Nazis were skilled, very skilled and creative in deploying the latest technologies, film, sound amplification, airplanes, even TV, and above all, the radio, which was the cell phone of their day. So how will we face these unprecedented questions, often with moral consequences, when social trust, especially in America, is so low? And especially, as a wise person once said, the scarcest resource in the 21st century is human attention. And the columnist Tom Friedman, you may know him here, he often says, everybody lives in cyberspace, but no one's in charge. Just think about the important questions we're facing regarding free speech and hate speech. And then imagine the questions we're going to confront about what it means to be human in light of developments in bioengineering and artificial intelligence. Remember, the Nazis invoked so-called racial science as modern advancements that would redefine humanity and morality. A few thoughts on what we must do. First, we need a relentless fidelity to historical truth, which will continue to be challenged by new technologies such as deepfakes, and of course by anti-Semites who want to rewrite history, such as Vladimir Putin. Speaking of Putin, it's worth mentioning that the museum has been working in countries throughout Europe for decades, copying their archives. You won't be surprised to learn that Russia, which holds millions and millions of pages of captured German documents from World War II, generally keeps their archives closed. On the other hand, Ukraine has become increasingly receptive to working with us and has opened all of their archives, enabling the museum to work with many Ukrainian scholars, most of whom are not Jewish. You also won't be surprised to learn that the more democratic Ukraine got, the more these scholars and the country as a whole have been interested in taking a hard look at its problematic past and the 1.5 million Jews killed there with significant local collaboration. And just as Ukraine has started honestly confronting its World War II history, as we know, Russia has been rewriting theirs and criminalizing historical truth. These warning signs from Putin, they've been around for quite a while, but most of us, and I put myself in this category, failed to heed them. And make no mistake, wherever historical truth is weaponized or denied, we should be very alarmed. And this is a museum, like our museum, that stands for historical truth. Because this weaponization of truth, this gives way to conspiracy theories and scapegoating, that road that for hundreds of years often led to violent anti-Semitism. By the way, who's responsible for one of the biggest conspiracy theories of all time, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which blames the Jews for pretty much everything? Who initially wrote this vile, still widely disseminated screed that was written over 120 years ago? Tsarist Russia's secret police. And where was mass violence against Jews most prevalent for decades, well before the Holocaust? Tsarist Russia. So we shouldn't really be so surprised that today anti-Semitism is increasingly prevalent in Russia's mainstream media and national discourse, because after all, it has those very deep roots in Russian history and culture. A second point I'd like to make is the politicization of the Holocaust has to end. It must stop being exploited by those who want to advance other agendas. At least in our country, the Holocaust has become the go-to comparison for everything. Individuals seeking to attract attention, demonize an opponent or a policy, or shut off debate often invoke the Holocaust. I'm not referring here to simplistic analogies from well-intentioned but less informed people. And I'm not referring to people, for example, who might reference the Nazis' annexation of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia to help us think about Putin's annexations in Ukraine. That is an example of the past helping us better understand and respond to the present. That's exactly why history education is so important. No, I'm referring to the deliberate weaponization of the Holocaust with full understanding that although it may be offensive, and although survivors will be deeply hurt, it's sure to command headlines. This debasement of the Holocaust shows no signs of letting up, at least in America. But I want to say something here that's worth pointing out about this alarming trend. People are very quick to invoke Hitler, the Gestapo, or the Nazis. They're not quick to invoke Stalin, the KGB, or the communists, whose regimes lasted far longer and killed far more people than the Nazis did. Perhaps in this problem lies a seed of opportunity, namely that Nazism and the Holocaust are still almost universally recognized as one of humanity's darkest moments. My third point is that the Holocaust seems incomprehensible, which is precisely why we must endeavor to comprehend it. We once assumed education, scientific progress, and democracy would protect us. But the Holocaust revealed these enduring truths about human capabilities, not only about simple categories such as good and evil, but more importantly, about all of us humans who normally don't inhabit either end of that spectrum and may occupy different places on that spectrum depending on the circumstances. Holocaust history demonstrates our susceptibility to resentment and indifference. And the latest scholarship now reveals that very ordinary motives, such as greed, fear, peer approval, and career advancement, can make us complicit in the face of anti-Semitism, racism, even genocide. Here in this amazing photo, you see Germans buying at auction the personal items that had belonged to their Jewish neighbors who had just been deported. Quite a picture. So history helps us look back, but of course life is lived forward. The citizens of the Weimar Republic did not realize they were standing on the abyss. The study of history helps us grasp just how susceptible they were. The Weimar Republic struggled to withstand multiple crises and rapid change. There was no strong foundation of democratic norms and practices. Germany's deep roots lay elsewhere. Social trust was lacking, critical thinking was lacking, as was any commitment to a pluralistic community. Jews, a long-standing and effective scapegoat throughout European history, became one yet again. History helps us see where warning signs were missed, where unintended consequences were not anticipated, and where wishful thinking prevailed. Hitler was put into power by German elites who thought they could control him. They shared his goals of confronting communism and ending democracy, and they planned to use him for this purpose. They literally said, "We're going to just hire him to do our bidding." That was their language. "We will hire him." But they completely dismissed what he had written 10 years earlier in Mein Kampf, where he outlined his thinking that skillfully combined these pre-existing ideas, such as ethno-nationalism, anti-Semitism, and scientific racism, into a single powerful ideology that would drive his movement and eventually the German nation. Hitler was bringing a new religion, but in the short term, he readily adopted Christianity's terminology as he believed he would be the savior of all of humanity, writing in Mein Kampf, quote, "I believe that by defending myself against the Jews, I am fighting for the work of the Lord." Today, we recognize Hitler's assumption of power as a warning sign, but at the time, many Germans regarded this as just another change in the government. After all, the Weimar Republic had been around for 14 years, during which it had 14 different chancellors. It would have been understandable to assume Hitler would be just another chancellor like the rest. I want to end by invoking again Elie Wiesel and his insistence on questions, and I have a question for you. Have you here in Australia heard of the acronym VUCA? Does anybody know this acronym? Great, well, I'm glad I'm introducing it to you. It stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity as ways to describe the moment we're living in. The Holocaust teaches that we human beings don't do well in such times, which is precisely why the Holocaust can help us navigate the perilous road ahead. I believe Holocaust history is uniquely suited to these times when we desperately need historical perspective, critical thinking, responsible civic engagement, and powerful moral anchors. Holocaust education should follow Elie Wiesel's mandate and lead to a new set of questions. It should simulate a new sense of individual responsibility. It should lead people to look back on the Holocaust and ask themselves not only what would I have done, but also to look ahead and ask, what will I do? Author Richard Powers said something that I think speaks to the heart of the work we do and this important institution does. He said, "The best arguments in the world won't change a single mind. The only thing that can do that is a good story." The Holocaust is one of humanity's most important and powerful stories. And as we learned from our early visitors, the Holocaust is indeed relevant. It is the story of us, the story of all of us. So how we tell it so that we protect truth, advance relevance, and inspire questions about warning signs and personal responsibility, that is the urgent task before us, before all of us. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for sharing your wisdom with us. And my name is Jane Josem. I'm the CEO here at the Melbourne Holocaust Museum. Sorry, got my back to you. Well, we try and work here with the Yad Vashem philosophy of safely in, safely out. So my very challenging task right now is to make sure we all get safely out by engaging in a bit of a Q&A with you. That was sort of a lot, quite heavy content, I think, to land at all of our feet. And, you know...
It's the Holocaust.
It is, I know, and we are obviously used to that here.
Human nature.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that I say about this museum, it's not my words, but there's a museum expert who says that a museum is a safe place for unsafe ideas, for difficult conversations, and that's certainly... we've started off with our first public event, obviously, with yet another difficult conversation. But thank you. And I guess I'm still processing a lot of what you said. One thing that, you know, we in redeveloping our museum, which is opening at some point next year, hopefully around April, it's interesting what you've just said, because one of the things that we've written out that we want our visitors to leave with the following question, which is, knowing what I now know, what is my responsibility in the world today? So it's very much echoing what you've just said. And in fact, the photo that you just had up of the Germans at the auction, I saw that photo for the first time at the Topography of Terror Museum in Berlin, and it just struck me, and I'm pretty sure we're going to have that one on display in the museum, because it really shows you what ordinary people were doing while this was going on, and I think that's been one of...
To their neighbours.
Yeah. So what I'm going to ask you more about is to talk about your museum. and its role in educating the general public. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about yourself, and I know that you had the great honour of working with Elie Wiesel at the museum, and I wanted to ask you to share with us something about that experience and particularly the strange Australian connection that comes through that story.
So I was teaching in a suburb of Sydney, and this is 1972 to 74, a very different Australia than I think you are today. And I was teaching what we would call in the United States, I think, seventh graders. I forget what you call them here, but very smart. I had the top ranked class. These are very smart young girls, women. And I was an English literature teacher, and we had a problem with never having enough books for the whole class. And I was looking around the textbook storage room one day, and I found a copy of Elie Wiesel's Night. And I thought, oh, well, this is great. This is a short, powerful book. I can read it to the class. I can do it in a few sessions, and we'll have a great conversation. And I read it to the class. I think it took maybe 2 classes to do it. And when I was done, at the end, the bell rings, the kids go to the next class, and my brightest student came up to me afterwards, and she said, "Oh, Miss Bloomfield, that was quite a story. And I noticed when you read it, you seemed to be full of emotion." And I said, "Well, Deborah, that's so, perspective of you. You're right. And that's because I'm Jewish." And she went, "Oh, you can't be Jewish. Don't worry. Your secret is safe with me." So anyway, I thought, I said, "It's not a secret." Anyway, she said, "Don't tell anyone. Please don't tell anyone." And I was completely thrown by this. I'd never experienced anti-Semitism, by the way, until I came to this country. And I had another incident, which was fairly minor. But anyway, so I went home and I thought about this. And today we would call this how to make it a teachable moment. So I went home and I came up with a lot of ideas, and I went back to my class. They had a lot of interethnic tensions in this school already. So I was going to build on that. And I did an exercise with them, which through the process of the exercise, we talked about our own identities. And, I asked them, do people have, they hated Croats and Serbs, they had Italians, Greeks, whatever it was, everybody hated somebody. And I said, "Well, do people hate the Jews?" I said, "Of course we hate the Jews. Are there any Jews here?" I raised my hand. And the class erupted into pandemonium. This young woman who had talked to me 2 days before, she was horrified. "I can't believe you're doing this." I could see the look on her face. Anyway, it was quite an experience. And my students said things to me like, "I can't believe you're Jewish. You're American. I can't believe you're Jewish. You're nice. I can't believe you're Jewish. You look like us." They had obviously never seen a Jew before. Anyway, it was an interesting conversation. Most of my students eventually were able to get over it. A few never quite did. It was very interesting. I've often thought about where those students are today. But so that was 74. And then, fast forward to 1986. I'm living in Cleveland, Ohio. I moved to Washington, D.C., not necessarily to work for the Holocaust Project. I just really want to get out of Cleveland, Ohio. So I go and, one of the first people I meet, I get this job, is Elie Wiesel. And I think, oh my God, was this destined for me back in Australia in the 1970s? That book, which so fundamentally changed my sense of myself as a Jew, my relationship with my students, and now here I was working with Elie on this project. Beshert, I guess, is that what we say?
So you talked a lot about social trust, and I wanted to ask you about museums and how do museums fit into this landscape in terms of people and trust, and what you discover about that?
Well, I don't know, I haven't kept up so much with what goes on in Australia, but in America, trust is really eroded across all of our institutions. And the American Alliance of Museums in 2021 did a survey to study this problem of trust in American society. And they found that the least trusted, what would you guess would be the least trusted parts of American society? Any guesses here? Government, politicians. Do we have any businessmen here? Business. And by the way, social media. I thought that was good, that was not so well trusted. I thought it was a good sign. What do you think's most trusted? Friends and family. But guess what was in second place? Museums. And in third place, researchers and scientists. And I think of that as very related to museums. We all deal with truth and authenticity. And indeed, when you asked the survey respondents, why do you find museums so trusted? They said things like, they display original objects. They are research-based. They don't have an agenda. They don't try to tell me what to think. Things like that. And that, by the way, that was one of our founding museological principles, is just to put history out there and use as many original objects as we could, but let the visitor draw their own conclusions. Any visitor that you're trying to manipulate will know that immediately.
Speaking about collections, which is one of my sort of passion areas, can you tell me about the collecting at the United States Holocaust Museum? Because you did mention and allude to copying archives from the former Soviet Union. So just tell us a little bit about that aspect of the mission of the centre.
Actually, something interesting about us is that, I'm just curious, how many people have been to the museum in Washington? Okay, so a lot of you, that's really wonderful, thank you. You might be interested to know that in those early years, we were never going to build a collection. We only collected things that were going to go on display in that exhibition. And then afterwards, people thought, well, how are you going to support research? How are you going to support temporary exhibitions? And frankly, as far as I'm concerned, that collection is also evidence of the crime. And it's a very unique kind of memorial to the victims. So we began collecting very aggressively, but not from the very beginning. Only, I would say, 25 years ago, we began working aggressively. Now we're doing copying of archives everywhere in Europe, but also places like, we've been to Japan, we've been to China, we've been to Morocco, we're in Argentina, we're anywhere Jews and Nazis were, we are. And of course, it was a world event, so we're copying archives all over the world. We're also collecting, we have a lot of artifacts from survivors in America, from World War II veterans who liberated the camps. But now we're in a major project to redo our main exhibition to make it more relevant. So we're doing collecting on a lot of what I talked about tonight, which is those deep roots and that rise of Nazism. How do you show, for example, what it was like as a German to live in those early periods of Nazism? For example, Germans had to have racial passports. Every German had one. Now, we've got the Jewish passport, but we need to show that in contrast to the ordinary German and the declaration of the purity of their Jewish blood. So we're trying to collect things like this, stories about Hitler Youth. What was it like for these young boys required to be in Hitler Youth? What did they really experience? And we have actually some interesting testimonies of young Jewish boys saying, well, I wanted to be in Hitler Youth. Of course you did, because all your classmates and your friends were. They didn't understand what it was. So trying to tell the Nazification of German society is a whole other area we're collecting. And let me just tell you, I'm sorry, I've got the floor.
No, please go.
I'll tell you a really interesting story. And I could tell you another one later if you want to hear, but really interesting. We were just acquired the personal photo album of the commandant from Sobibor, one of the 6 killing centers. Where was that photo album all these years? It was in the house of this perpetrator's grandson under the kitchen sink. And someone in the family discovered it. They contacted some local German historians. Luckily, those historians verified it. Those historians came to us. Happily, we had this relationship. And now that photo album is in our collection. And by the way, it has pictures that corroborate some testimony. It's very rare to have testimonies from Sobibor, but we had a testimony in our collection from a survivor who said, I remember hearing geese. People thought the guy's crazy. And we now have a picture of those geese there. Do you know why they were there? To deceive the victims as they arrived and to cover up the noise. But now we can connect those dots. And we're digitizing our collection so that we can connect more dots and so that great institutions like this can have access to everything we have.
Yeah, thank you. And I have already thanked you because when we try and put an exhibition on, we're trawling through a lot of different archives, and the United States Holocaust Museum archive is really wonderful to navigate. And I, have thanked you for what your institution does for not just our museums across the world, researchers, and the Holocaust Encyclopedia as well is another amazing project. And maybe you want to talk about the Camps and Ghettos Encyclopedia and how that started and where that ended up.
So one of the things that we try to see our role as trying to help the whole field of Holocaust education and scholarship because we have resources that most people don't have. So our job is to help everybody. So about 15 years ago, we decided to create a major reference work, an encyclopedia of all sites of incarceration across German-dominated Europe. So this would be everything from the tiniest little Gestapo cell somewhere to Auschwitz and everything in between. And at the beginning of the project, our historians who were leading this effort estimated that there would be 7,000 sites. And I remember I thought, oh my gosh, that's a lot. Really impressive. Well, guess where they are now? 42,500. This is across the whole continent. And of course, it really just means that all those Europeans who said, we didn't hear anything, we didn't see anything, not possible.
So what are some of the things you're doing next? What are some of your sort of priorities? I know you're working on a new exhibition.
Right. Well, our magnificent exhibition, which I did not create. I have nothing to do with the creation of it. I just happened to be there doing another job when that was being created. I mean, it's still incredibly powerful, but it doesn't talk about why the Holocaust happened. And there's so much new scholarship in 30 years, thanks to the fall of the Soviet Union, that we can tell stories about these bigger ideas. So we can tell more about Nazi propaganda, Nazi racial science, collaboration and complicity, which I know you've seen that exhibit, or one of your team is that loves that exhibit. So all these things that help explain. We have one right now on America and the Holocaust. And so we are going to revitalize our main exhibition, and it's going to be focused on 6 big ideas. The first one is the decline of German democracy, the nature of Nazi racial anti-Semitism and that whole ideology, how it worked, the motivation, behavior, and choices of elites and ordinary people, not the true believers, but the people who make the ideas of the true believers possible. The role of the war in the genocide of the Jews, no war, no genocide. Jewish responses, of course, and American and world responses, and talk about things that we hadn't talked about before, like the Vatican, the International Red Cross, the role of the German churches, the role of the German military, all those institutions that made the Holocaust possible. So all those themes will run throughout the exhibition, and we hope it will inspire them to do more critical thinking. Sadly, the theme of democracy, of course, will be over quickly.
So how does the critical thinking come through? In what way are you looking for your visitors to develop that? Is it purely by exposing them to the events, the artefacts?
So we're going to experiment with a new strategy that we call multi-perspectivity, and I'll use Kristallnacht because of your video tonight. So Kristallnacht is obviously a turning point, and people knew it was a big deal at the moment. We don't want to go back and for people to say this was a turning point. People didn't really. We want to put people in that moment. But the Jews knew it was a big deal. Ordinary Germans knew it was a big deal. They didn't like Kristallnacht, by the way. It's too messy, too disorderly. They were fine with the Jews leaving Germany. They didn't want it to disrupt their orderly lives. But we now can tell stories about Kristallnacht from different perspectives. So we call this the multi-perspective approach, where we obviously can talk about what the Nazis were trying to accomplish. We can talk about what it was like for the Jews. But what about the ordinary German? So we now know that there were, for example, firemen who, of course, obeyed the German orders not to put out the fires, right? Stand back and watch. Most of them did. Not all of them did. We have evidence and pictures of firemen who defied orders and put out those flames. We also just discovered photographs of Kristallnacht where school teachers took their children to watch the synagogues being destroyed. And we can show those pictures. So again, we're going to try to tell that story from all the different perspectives and what people were concluding.
I'm going to ask you a bit about your visitors, but one group that you did talk to us about was getting groups like the police and the armed forces. Do you want to talk a little bit about the programs that you have for those groups?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how this got started, which is DC at one point, many years ago, was the murder capital of the world. And we fired our police chief, and we imported a police chief from Chicago. And he came to the museum, another VIP visitor. We had a lot, so nobody really paid much attention to him. But he really paid attention to this exhibit. He, by the way, is African American, and he kept seeing in pictures, photographs in the museum, ordinary policemen, not Nazis, not SS, not brown shirts, ordinary policemen who had been ordinary policemen in the Weimar Republic. And I wasn't his tour guide, but one of my colleagues was, and he kept saying, well, what was that policeman's training? Did that policeman swear an oath to a constitution like I do? Do they have professional ethics? And he was just incredibly curious because he saw many pictures with ordinary German policemen. So he was so taken with it. He said, can I bring my whole command staff back to the museum? I want to see if they have the same reaction I did. So I remember coming to work like a couple of weeks later, and I drive up to work, and they're like police cars lined up. I think, oh my God, something terrible's happened. No, he's brought the entire command staff to the museum, and he wanted to see if they had the same reaction, which they did. So as a result of that, he asked us if we would put together an educational program for police recruits that look at this transformation of German policing from the Democratic Weimar Republic, where they swore an oath to a democratic constitution, and how gradually policing became Nazified and ultimately complicit in war and genocide. And we now train every FBI agent in this program. It's been replicated around the country. We do similar programs for the US military, all of our military academies, looking at the role of the German army, also once a respected institution that also was very skeptical of Hitler in the beginning, ultimately went along and was responsible not only for the war, but now we know it played a big role in the genocide of the Jews. Oh, and the judiciary. We do training for the judiciary.
So I want to ask about your visitors. So obviously you have a lot of visitors every year. And I'm aware you do extensive research on the visitors. So can you tell us a little bit about who are the people coming, international visitors, local, and what is your data telling you about them and the experience they're having? And the other thing I'm curious is, do you know who isn't coming, and are you doing work to try and break
It's a
into
good
those
question. So we, as I said, we're redoing our main exhibition. The first thing we did was we spent a year doing visitor research and did all sorts of different kinds of things, looking at we have visitors off the National Mall in Washington, just tourists. That's important for us. And we have these leaders that we trained. I mentioned law enforcement, judiciary, people that influence American society and preserve democracy. But our most important audience is what we call emerging adults, high school, college, a little post-college, where young people are making very important decisions about their life, their values, their sense of community, country, identity, whatever those are. So, we looked at the age groups. It's one thing in America, I don't know if it's true here, but you're not allowed to ask questions of minors when you do visitor research. So our data is a little bit, not so clear on that. But we have a sense that about a third of our visitors are students. 22% are minorities, which is good, but I think that's definitely an area we'd like to improve. America is, become an extremely diverse nation, and we'd like to get all parts of American diversity represented. One thing that shocked me was that the average visit is 2 hours and 7 minutes, which is a lot, especially when you're in a city that has about 15 other great museums right next to you, and they're all free. But one of the things, so we did surveys of our visitors. We also we sent our staff to follow students through their entire day. So they went out with these kids that were staying at some hotel way, way, way out in Virginia somewhere, got up at 7 a.m., had breakfast, were put on a bus and taken to like 5 museums in one day, and then dropped off in a Chinese restaurant. She spent the entire day with these kids. And she went to every museum they went to. Ours was just one. I think there were 5 total. And she said, we're the only museum they talked about at the end of the day. And I think it's that Richard Powers quote. It's that story. It's such a powerful story. And unlike, the Natural History Museum is telling, hundreds of thousands of years of natural history. It's a hard story to grasp. We have 12 years of one event, but it's graspable in that 2-hour visit. So we learned that. We also learned that less is more, and that in a lot of our displays, if we have too many items for people to look at, they will look at nothing. So I shared with staff here the other day that we had a segment on the Nuremberg laws, denying Jews their citizenship. We think it's one of the most important exhibits. People are just walking right by it. Why were they walking right by it? Well, we had, 2 posters, 4 photographs, 1 artifact, just too much going on. We took it from 6 elements down to 3, and we translated 1 poster into English, and now everybody stops. And not only stops, they have conversations about it. So just little changes like that really show engagement. And the last thing is we've done a lot of testing of technology, thinking young people will want technology. They don't. We've tested, we've tried to make it easy. We've asked them when they're not using the technology, why not? If we did it this way, would it be easier? We did it that way. Nope, I don't come to a museum to get on my phone. I come to a museum to get off my phone. That's some hope for humanity.
I've got one final question. I noticed earlier this week I got a message from the United States Holocaust Museum. You'd made a statement about anti-Semitism. So I just want to know when and how, and how you go about the process. How often do you comment on current events, and how does that come about? Because obviously, this is an issue that's concerning to all of us. So please explain.
Well, we're not an advocacy organization. Advocacy organizations affect change in a certain way. We believe education also affects change. It's more of a long-term project because you're trying to change mindset and you're trying to change it with people over time. You all send your kids to school, not for 1 year, but for many years, because you realize that is a process over time to develop those critical thinking skills and an awareness of history, and basic knowledge for life. So we don't advocacy organizations, of course, issue statements. That's their lifeblood. This is wrong. This is what should be done. This is where we stand. We rarely issue statements. We believe the less we issue statements, the more powerful it is when we do it. And we have very rigid criteria. And we don't, if we issued a statement every time there was some major anti-Semitic thing in America, it would be a lot. And nobody would pay attention because it's, the Holocaust Museum issuing yet another statement on anti-Semitism. So when we do speak, I think more people pay attention. We use social media much more as a way to be in the conversation and to take where people are thinking. Like, one of the things that I have come to the conclusion is that Americans, they know something about the Holocaust. It's so much in popular culture. I'm not sure they understood what anti-Semitism was. Now, maybe in light of some of the incidents that have happened, certainly the last several months or the last several years with these synagogue shootings, they're hearing it. But I have a sense from young people, they did not connect, for some reason, anti-Semitism with the Holocaust. Even though they could have told you that, Hitler killed 6 million Jews, they might have been able to say that. They didn't make those kinds of connections. So we think social media is a much better way to take whatever's happening out in the culture and then drive people back to some of our educational resources. So we only issue statements on very rare occasions. It will have to do with, we think something's happening in the country that's exceptional and unusual, and we always tie it to Holocaust history. We also issue them. We have a program that deals with contemporary genocide, and we will issue them for that, because one of Elie Wiesel's visions for the museum is that we should do for victims of genocide today what was not done for the Jews of Europe, and that act of trying to save lives would be part of our memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe.
Thank you. First of all, I've got a few people to thank. I want to thank again Terry and John O'Lazarus on behalf of the late Leon and Judy Goldman and your grandparents for carrying on the legacy of the Betty and Shmuel Rosencrantz oration, and really gifting to the community this opportunity to hear from incredible international experts on the Holocaust, and tonight has been no exception. I want to thank Holocaust survivors, a few with us today, but all the Holocaust survivors in our community for their inspiration and vision, which guides my team every day. And on that note, I want to thank my team, my incredible team, who've helped work tirelessly to put this event together. So thank you to all of you guys. And I want to thank our donors, our community of supporters, investors in humanity, which is a new phrase that I've learnt from Sara, and all of you for being interested in our work. And of course, our main thanks go to Sara Bloomfield. Thank you so much for your insightful, thoughtful, powerful actual sort of history that you've just shared with us, the importance of the work that you're doing that really guides the work that institutions like ours are doing as well. Thank you for battling against jet lag and a migraine. No one would have noticed that, but you've done an incredible job. Thank you.